Hi everyone, this is Melissa Keller, Director of Events and Project Management for Vineyard Worship. We release new music on the first Friday of every month. Vineyard Worship is truly a global family with over 2,400 churches worldwide. Familia, Vineyard Worship's latest monthly single, is a perfect representation of this reality. Featuring Tina Colon-Williams on vocals and produced by Grammy Award winner Dwan Hill, Familia is an organically bilingual, joyful celebration of the family of God.
Let's come together and worship the Lord. Todos juntos. We are a family, the family of God. Somos familia de Dios. We are a family, the family of God. Somos familia de Dios. Somos familia en la gloria, como hoy es cielo.
Find Familia and all of Vineyard Worship singles wherever you listen to music.
I think one reason that we as leaders are sometimes unchanged is that we won't ask other people, a coach, a mentor, someone who's discipling us, or even our kids or someone in the community. We won't invite feedback. We won't ask people to hold up a mirror to me so that I can see what's going on. In fact, we avoid that, right? And when people try to tell us what you're doing is divisive, or somebody tries to tell us, here's something that's missing from what you're teaching, or have you thought about this different way? We get really, really defensive. As long as we're defensive, we will remain unchanged.
The Ferment. You're listening to the Ferment podcast, conversations about worship and transformation. Today's guest is licensed counselor Trisha Taylor, co-author of The Leader's Journey.
Hey, what up, everybody? You are listening to the Ferment podcast, and today my very special guest is Trisha Taylor. What up, Trisha?
Hi, it's fun to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here, because I guess I just have to make this disclaimer right up front. You have been like a transformation coach for me for like the last, 7 or 8 months? 6?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so you and I kind of got to know each other in this context, and just from some of my interactions with you, and because this podcast is called The Ferment, and because kind of the controlling metaphor that we use here is that things change, that hopefully in our spiritual lives we're growing, we're developing, we're evolving. I just thought,
yeah,
I have to have you
hopefully. On. Well, good. Well, I'm really glad to be here.
I know you a little bit, but I'm afraid a lot of our people who are listening don't. So I would just love it if you would tell us a little bit of your story. Tell us where you're from. Tell us about your faith history, and maybe how did you come to work in the healing and transformation space?
Yeah, that's I would love to tell part of that story. Maybe start with the present and say that now I'm in Houston.
Yes.
And but I was born in West Texas, mostly raised in Central Texas. So I'm a Texas girl all the way through. My dad was a school superintendent. Mom was a teacher. So, that gives you an idea about what education meant in our family. And then also on top of that, Dad was always a deacon as long as I can remember. And Mom taught a Bible study in our home. And so faith was just a huge part of growing up. I grew up in a Southern Baptist. Not only was my family Southern Baptist, my church was, but kind of the town was to some degree,
Yeah, that's normal in the South.
when you talk about the ferment, see, like, I don't know anything about fermentation growing up in a Southern Baptist household.
Of course not.
I'm joking. But, I was born on a Monday and my parents had me in church on Sunday.
That's right.
And, that was just my life. I was really drawn to church. I'm so grateful for the love of church and the love of the Bible that I got growing up in that context. And then another stream, I think, joined that one that I think might be interesting to your listeners. When I was in high school, I started walking down to the Assemblies of God church that was at the end of our street, and then hang a right, and discovered a whole new world and a whole new language. And that led to some other things that led me to Highland Church in Waco. And so God kind of got at me from several different directions. And then, of course, it's just been adding streams since then. I was called into ministry very memorably as a 10-year-old. It was unmistakable. And then trying to figure out what that looked like as a girl in a Southern Baptist church got really complicated. And I went to Baylor as a religion major, and my dad had the wisdom to say, well, honey, you can do that, but why don't you think about having something else too? And so around that time, I went to see a counselor about some of my own stuff, and that process changed my life. And I said, I want to do this. Still thought I would be more in a shepherding ministry. I joke sometimes God led me first not to be a shepherd, but to be a vet, to kind of treat wounded sheep one at a time.
Yeah.
And then led me back into shepherding later in my life. So what started out as a plan B turned out to be a great plan A. And I have been a therapist for, oh my gosh, I don't even want to think about how many years, and have worked with pastors and church leaders for 25, 30 years, and then also work with congregations, denominations, kind of just the whole range.
Yeah. So part of what I hear in your story is you just grew up loving Jesus, and you felt very called, and maybe even some of the constraints on your own, from your own tradition, from the Southern Baptist tradition, led you into kind of like the healing fields through college and whatnot. And it really became in some ways providential,
Yes, exactly.
Like what you thought was maybe a left turn becomes the right turn.
Yes. There's no doubt that God was at work in all of that. I was ordained almost 20 years ago now. And that is also a miraculous story and a wonderful story that kind of closed that loop for me, where I could see God's hand at work in every part of that story.
Love that. That is so good. Well, let's just jump into some of the stuff that you are really good at. Like I wrote you in the email. I wrote you in an email and just said, hey, this podcast is about spiritual transformation. It's one of our controlling metaphors. So I would love just for you to talk to us about spiritual or soul transformation. What does that mean to you, and how does it happen?
That's a wonderful thing to be talking about, because I think every person who comes to me, every congregation, every group who comes to me for help, what they're really asking way down deep is, can I change? Can we change? And by the time I see them, there's some real resignation and cynicism about that, because they bumped up against that so many times. Most of the people that I see are not shaking their fist at God and saying, I refuse to change. They're saying, I want to change, and I don't know how. And, or at least I want to change, right? And so how does that happen? Sometimes absolutely miraculously, right? And we have an experience that changes us forever. But mostly, I think we change like we see things change in nature. We change through seasons. We change through growth. We change through, maturity. And it's often a slow process and a process that's hard to track. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how people change, and there are a lot of answers I could give, but the one that I'm working out of right now comes from James Bryan Smith, where he talks about 3 components of spiritual change that we have to be able to change our narratives, the story that we're telling about our lives, about God, about all of that. We have to be willing to change our practices, that there has to be a component of what we're actually doing that needs to change. And then we also need to do this in community, that it has to happen with other people. And then as he describes it, he puts the Holy Spirit, he kind of lays the Holy Spirit on top of all that. And this is my language, not his, but kind of says there's a part of that process that only we can do and a part of that process that only God can do. And that's what I believe.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to something that you said there at the beginning, that oftentimes when people or groups come to you, they're wanting to know if they can change. And you use the word resignation, which made me think, oh, maybe people are trying to change, but maybe they failed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So is that
Yes.
something that you experience when people come to you?
Oh, absolutely. They have a long, by the time they come to me, they're ready to throw some money at it, right? So they've tried all the free stuff before they get to me.
Yeah.
And, I even think about in the churches I grew up in, we had altar calls. And I remember that almost everyone who would go forward during the altar call to respond to something that God was saying in their lives were young people. And I was very judgmental, right? The old people are just, they're stuck in their ways. They don't care about God. They're not listening to God. I was very judgmental about that. We young people is where the Spirit is at work. But I think what I have learned over time is that they had that experience, and just walking forward hadn't changed things for them. And so that was no longer, and I think one of the reasons for that is that we are just wired as human beings to look for quick fixes.
Yeah.
It's just in us.
Yeah.
And when we try and try and try, and the quick fix doesn't work, we do get really resigned and cynical. We wonder, is there hope for me? What's wrong with me? Why does God change other people and not me?
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I love that little story you shared, because there's just so much wisdom in that, right? Like, especially for church people, we have seen young people go forward, or, and there is, I just think that's very insightful. Yeah. Maybe part of what's happening there is just after you try for a little while, you just think, what am I doing? That isn't going to work.
Exactly.
Okay. So you also mentioned, when you were talking about change, you mentioned the word slow, seasonal, gradual, nature, which
Right.
I really resonate with those words. In the Bible, we have this picture, God is definitely the God of the instantaneous, but he's also the God of the gradual, right? He's the God of the slow. In fact, I did a podcast with Susan O'Brien a few weeks ago. She's somebody that's kind of in our vineyard worship world, and she talked about the slow work of God, and it was really beautiful.
Yeah.
Could you talk to our audience about that a little bit, especially from your perspective of maybe, changing our practices and changing some of what we do that's different, and how this might not be a quick fix, but it might be seasonal or slow?
Yeah, I think that there are not many things that do happen instantaneously. And so if I want to change in some way, like I want to learn to play a musical instrument, or I want to learn a new sport, which I never wanted to learn a new sport. But, in theory,
Yeah.
I would understand that if I were wanting to play the piano, I would have to learn to play scales. If I were wanting to learn a new sport, I would have to do drills. But spiritually, we have this, and relationally, I would say also emotionally, we have these ideas that these things should just happen. And if they don't, then there's something wrong with us. And yet, I think what happens over time is that we practice. It's one of the reasons that I love the analogy of discipleship being a disciple is by definition a learner. And learning happens over time. We do not send children to kindergarten for their first day. And then when they come home, we don't say, so did you learn to read? Well, no, they didn't learn to read. And we understand that. That learning is something that is holistic and it takes time. And our discipleship, I think, fits that model.
Yeah. So part of what I'm hearing you say is that the endeavor to change, or I'm going to use the word to mature, that the endeavor to mature, that's a good thing. And it could be slow. Mm-hmm. And because it probably is going to be slow, we can take some of that pressure off of ourselves. We can let go of that need to be instantly different.
Yes.
Take ourselves off the hook a little bit there.
Absolutely. Sometimes that is more about wanting to look good than it is about actually wanting transformation.
Oh, talk to me about that.
Well,
because I want to perform. I mean, that's part of my story right there, Trisha. Yeah. Like, I want to look good. I want you to think good thoughts about me.
Exactly. I don't want to learn in public. I don't want to, I don't want to have to be a beginner.
Yeah.
I want to look like I know what I'm doing. I want to look like I have it together, and I want to avoid situations where I don't. And yet those things are absolutely the opposite of being a learner. In order to be a learner, we have to be willing to be a beginner.
Yeah. And some of what we're talking about being a beginner in includes, some really difficult stuff, especially for the public space, because what we're talking about here is emotional and spiritual relational maturity, which is like, how do I deal with anxiety? Like, how do I deal with difficulty or difficult people on my team? Or what if I do the work deep enough? And this is the kind of the question that's been rolling around in my head for the last few months is, what if I find out I'm the problem on my team?
Well,
that's the part I don't want to be public.
Already, I hate to break it to you.
Yes.
But we're all the problem on our team, right? I mean, there's a sense in which maturity on one level is the willingness to stop looking at everyone else and start paying attention to what am I doing or not doing, saying or not saying, being or not being, that is contributing to the results we're getting.
Yeah.
So
I know that's a very family systems approach, right? So I know that's something I've learned from you. You and Jim have basically taught me and us, and by that I mean the Vineyard executive team. You've been teaching us that we're all a part of the results we're currently getting.
Yes.
I think that's what I've been hearing
all the time.
Yes. That's a hard thing to hear.
It is. It is. And we can come up with a million reasons why other people are the problem. Yeah. And some of those reasons are not wrong. But at the end of the day, the magic question is, okay, given that all that is true, we'll just assume it's true.
Yeah.
How am I going to show up in the middle of this? Who am I going to be?
Yeah.
And that, I think, recognizes that whatever results we're getting, we've all contributed to. And the only person I have any control over is me.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and what I'm hearing in that is that's sort of your working definition of maturity, like the willingness to take ownership for that part, right? I can't keep blaming. I can't keep practicing distance or conflict, some of those things that you've been teaching us. I just have to go, well, what is my part that I've been contributing?
Yes, and to be able to do that from a place where it really is just all about the learning, right? So I have 2 kids, and one of them, when you would bring to their attention that, somehow they had fallen short, would just argue with you, just bow up, right? And tell you in 3 points why, I mean, he's 4 years old, he would do this, why he was right and you're wrong, and why his way of doing it was the right way. And I mean, you could not get through to him. And then our second child was exactly the opposite. When you would point something out to her, she would immediately just dissolve right into, I'm so sorry, and I'll never do it again, and all the shame and guilt and all that, right? And so, I remember as a parent of these two, I remember thinking, when God is trying to show me my part in something, I toggle back and forth between those things. Either I want to bow up and defend myself, or I just fall apart in shame and guilt. And I just wonder if God might sometimes be just like, I don't really need all the drama. Let's just learn something here, right? Yes. I'm just trying to help you learn.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's what maturity looks like when we finally get to that place that we just say, okay, God, I can see what's going on here. I can see my part, and I'm ready to learn something different.
Well, talk to me about this. Why is it there's so many Christian leaders? And I'm talking about people who really do love Jesus. Not fake, like they really are committed to Jesus. Why are so many Christian leaders unchanged?
Yeah, that causes all kinds of problems, doesn't it? And I'm going to put myself in that category, to be perfectly honest. I am not as changed as I wish I was. But there are a few reasons why I think that happens. One is, I'm not always sure that we have the expectation for change. I mean, I think we really underestimate how much God wants to not just improve us, but to really transform us. But I also think a thing that is in the system that I think keeps that in place is that, at least in many traditions, we confuse getting information with actually growing spiritually. And so the people that really get praised for being spiritually mature are often the people who know all the Bible verses, who have done all the discipleship courses and have all the notebooks with all the blanks filled in. And all of those are wonderful practices that help us. But I'm not sure that we always in the church necessarily measure spiritual maturity by things like love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. I think that there has been maybe too much emphasis on what we're getting with our heads and whether we have right doctrine and whether we believe all the stuff, and less emphasis on to what extent is it actually making us a different person.
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed, even in my own life, is, okay, so it's pretty easy to get information. I mean, we carry little computers in our pockets everywhere. Information is everywhere. Actually putting it to practice, that's more difficult. And one of the things I've noticed is most of the time, I actually need somebody to help me practice. I mean, I'm even thinking all the way back to when I was a kid playing Little League basketball and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I needed, we would play basketball in the schoolyard, but we didn't get better. And I needed a coach to give me drills or to notice things that I wasn't noticing about my own. I'm just, we're full sports metaphors now, my own game. And I noticed that's kind of true in every area of my life. I need that outside perspective to help me, put some of that stuff into play. Is that something that you see? Is that something that's pretty standard? Talk to me about that.
I think so. I mean, I think one reason that we as leaders are sometimes unchanged is that we won't engage that process that you're talking about. We won't ask other people, a coach, a mentor, someone who's discipling us, or even someone, our kids, or someone in the community, we won't invite feedback. We won't ask people to hold up a mirror to me so that I can see what's going on. In fact, we avoid that, right? And when people try to tell us, let's say, what you're doing is divisive, or somebody tries to tell us, here's something that's missing from what you're teaching, or have you thought about this different way? We get really, really defensive, right? And so as long as we're defensive, we will remain unchanged. I think Jesus' culture understood more than we do about that idea of needing someone who's farther along in the journey to walk with us, but also to help us to see ourselves, to call us to more than we can be by ourselves. But I think we tend to resist that. People who go into leadership want to be that person. They don't want to have that person, often.
What up, songwriters? Adam here. I want to tell you something that's coming up in November. November 8 and 11, and then also on 16 and 18, we are hosting a virtual edition of Song Lab. That is a Monday and Wednesday on 2 consecutive weeks. 4 sessions total. These sessions will be inspirational, they will be instructive, and they will be geared towards actually writing. We're going to make space for you to co-write with others in long writing blocks so that after these sessions are finished, everyone will have written on at least 3 different songs. We will be joined by Dee Wilson from Common Hymnal, and then also Leslie Jordan, and maybe you know Leslie from her days in All Sons and Daughters. And we'll also be joined by several of our very best Vineyard Worship friends. So if you're wanting to write, if you're wanting to grow, if you're wanting to refine your craft, this is the event for you. Sign up at vineyardworship.com. Let's go down to this next section of things that I wanted to talk to you about, which is very much in line with what we've been talking about already. But you and Jim have really helped me get a handle on differentiation. And one of the ways that you've been talking to me about it has been through very simple language of being defined and connected. I really, really love this. I think this is so manageable, and it's easier for me to carry into my own family system or relationships, and even working relationships here at the church or in the Vineyard USA world. Can you just talk to the podcast listeners about what is differentiation and what do you mean by defined and connected, and why is that important in like relational systems where people are working together and living together?
I think there's so much we could say about differentiation.
Yes.
That's one of the reasons that it's nice to have something with a handle on it, right? But the idea of differentiation being our ability to be a self, and for our purposes here, I would say the ability to be the self we were created to be in the midst of all the emotional... The emotional field is what we call it, but just life where there are constant pressures for us to be otherwise. That we are differentiated when we can live according to our deeply held values, despite all the pressure from other people and from all of our emotional connections with them to do or be something else. And Christians often get all worked up about the idea of, well, we're not supposed to have a self, I think we could talk about this all day, But I think God has obviously very specifically created us to be distinct and individual selves. It's just a matter of how all that gets distorted and then what it looks like to step back into being able to be a self in our relationships. So that brings us to defined and connected. And what does that mean? And I would say it's the capacity. So the capacity to define myself has two parts. And most of us are better at one part than the other. The first part is that I define myself when I am able to clearly and courageously, with my words and my actions, say, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I think, this is what I want, this is what I will do or what I won't do. So that's part one. And at the same time, to be willing to allow other people to define themselves. To remember that God has given them the ability to say, with their words and actions, what they want, what they think, what they will or won't do. And that is so tricky to do both those things. And then to make it trickier, to do both those things while staying connected, even if we are defining ourselves differently from each other.
Yeah.
And to try to do all that at the same time is a lifelong pursuit.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that if we're creating a culture where people can be defined and we're hoping to be connected, that the more we have a culture of, I'll use like freedom. I'll use the word freedom here. A culture of freedom where people can be defined and can say it and live into it, that eventually we are going to find areas where their definition of themselves is counter to how I see the world or experience the world, right?
Right.
So what you're talking about is you're talking about in some ways, at least in the short term, increasing conflict. Like conflict isn't just going to magically go away. Can you just talk to me about that? Because a lot of times at church or in Christian community, what we're hoping to do is like, no peace, like we just no conflict, like or whatever.
Right.
And I don't think anybody's hoping for conflict, but I'm just noticing that as I live some of this out and as I understand it, that conflict is in some ways the price that one has to pay for real and true community.
I think we're not going to be willing to engage the conflict until we really believe what Paul had to say about the church, which is you are going to have parts that are really different from each other, and you don't have a body without all the parts.
Amen.
I mean, we don't really believe that. I mean, what we really believe is that we should all be stem cells, where we're all undifferentiated from each other and we're all exactly alike. But we're not. We're heart cells and brain cells, and some of us are hands and some are feet. And he even mentions some of the unmentionable parts of us, and that until we believe that until all the parts of the body are interacting healthily together, we don't actually have the body of Christ in its fullness, we won't be willing to engage the conflict. Conflict done well helps us to get to better decisions. It helps us to avoid mistakes, but because we didn't see the whole picture. It helps us to make sure that everybody is on board once we're ready to move forward. We may even move forward in different directions, and God can bless that. But until we're willing to say, my perspective matters, and I need to say what I see. God needs for me to contribute my perspective. And it is just as important for me to listen and be curious about and seek to understand what other people see that I don't.
Yeah.
And I see that as love your neighbor as yourself, right? Like I know what I think and why I think it. If I'm going to love you as I love myself, I need to be as interested in what you think and why you think it. But that's not what we actually believe.
I love that.
We have brains that tell us all the time, people who are different from us are a threat. And we are constantly bumping up against that. And that's where the kind of conflict that's destructive, that is, full of strife, that's where that kind of conflict comes from, I think.
That's really helpful. I'm wondering if you could suggest an exercise or two that could help me become more defined. Because I'm just aware of, while you're talking, that some of this is really, it's deeply connected to self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times my definedness, and I'm using air quotes, is more emotional. It's coming from the non-thinking part of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I hear you say is it would be really good to be able to articulate what is true for me and how I experience the world. And so is there an exercise or two that can help us just begin to get a handle on our true self?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. First of all, I would say one of the key parts of differentiation is being able to differentiate my thinking from my feeling. Do I know when I'm feeling just in my feelings? Do I know when I'm in my thinking? Well, one exercise that I like, that I teach, I use it, is to just take a piece of paper, like a piece of printer paper, draw a line down the middle, and then a line horizontally. So you've got 4 quadrants, and just label the quadrants. I think or believe, I feel, I want, I choose. Those are your 4 quadrants. And then just brainstorm, just dump out everything that's in your thinking, your being, in those 4 quadrants. And one of the things that you'll start to see is, first of all, there's a lot more there than you thought. And second, you'll be able to see, oh, I have some beliefs and I have some feelings that might be at odds with each other, for example. Maybe I believe that I need to love my enemy, but my feelings are that I want to hurt my enemy. For example, I can define what is it that I really want. So, for example, maybe I want to hurt my enemy, but more than I want that, I want to please God. And I can get clear about that as I start to write all that down. And then what do I choose? What am I going to do with this? That brings us back to that magic question that I think is part of this. We want to vent, we want to say all the things, but after we have said all the things, the question has to be, okay, given this, how am I going to show up? And until we're willing to name out loud, this is who I'm going to be in this challenging situation. And if I can't be that now, I'll keep practicing till I can. That's another way to do that. And then I think a third way is anything we can do to calm our bodies is going to be helpful to us in this process. Anything we can do to help ourselves get settled down. There is a trainer in marriage counseling who, when he sees couples, he puts a pulse oximeter on them. Because if their pulse rate gets over a certain beats per minute, he shuts it down. He doesn't let them talk anymore because they are are physiologically hijacked at that point. They are so much in their feelings, nothing good is going to happen.
Yeah.
And, and then teaches them how to kind of bring themselves back to a place where they can think and pray. And so anything we can do to learn to calm our bodies, to be still and know that God is going to be helpful.
I love that, because you're right. We're not just thinking or feeling, like our bodies are deeply connected to everything that you've been talking about, right?
Absolutely.
What a funny picture. I love that. Yeah, I'm shutting this down. You're at 120 BPM. We're done.
Yeah, right.
When you get to 80, we'll start this conversation over again.
Exactly.
Okay, maybe 2 more questions and then we'll wrap, because I know you have another meeting. So that you just talked to us about being defined there, and even some exercises we could do just to be a bit more self-aware about who we really are or who we want to be. Talk to me about being connected or staying connected to people after I've defined myself and maybe after they've defined themselves. Because that's really important, right? It's not just I get to say what I want, you get to say what you want. Like we want to stay connected because we are a body.
Exactly. And this is where I think Jesus is such a wonderful example for us, because there's no doubt that he defined himself really well. I mean, he said, I am. how many times? He literally defined himself. And at the same time, he was always letting other people define themselves. In fact, he was being curious about them. He asked lots of questions. And I don't think they were gotcha questions. I think many times he was actually asking people, how do you see this? And yet he would go to dinner with anybody. That was one of the things that he got criticized for. We know that he was criticized for going to dinner with quote unquote sinners. But I cannot help but imagine that he was also criticized for going to dinner at Simon's house, quote unquote, the oppressor, or right. Matthew's house, the tax collector. That's right. He defined himself really clearly. He invited other people to define themselves clearly. And then at the end of the day, he would have dinner with anybody. In fact, sometimes he even invited himself.
I love it.
And I think that what we often do is we hear people define themselves, and in our heads we go, okay, are they us or are they them? I think they're them. Let's don't go to dinner at their house anymore. Not literally, right? But, when we're thinking, who do we want to hang out with? We just kind of cross them off our list.
Yeah, we make this circle of hospitality really small, don't we?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And we just need to widen that to a place where we can be curious about other people, where we can want to hear their story, where we've let go of the idea that, well, you've defined yourself wrong, so I need to change you, and just be willing to be in relationship with people. And like I said, I think Jesus is the perfect example for that. He really Jesus lived in a society that was even more polarized than the one we lived in. And so I think he's a wonderful model for what that looks like.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, Trisha, I want to ask you one more question. And this is the question that we end every single one of the podcasts with this season. I didn't tell you this question on purpose because I want it to come from your heart. Would you tell us what you're dreaming about these days? What's the dream of your heart? And it doesn't have to be the most epic thing in the world. But what's kind of fueling your fire right now?
I have a dream about eating in restaurants again.
Hey, same.
Eating in restaurants,
same.
Right? So
yes.
that's a dream.
Yes.
and being able to hug my parents and that kind of thing. But the thing that came into my mind first, just because I just spend so much time thinking about this, is that I really do have a dream that the people of God will model what it looks like to be together in the face of difference. I really, really, to be the body of Christ with all the differentness. I think about that a lot. And right now, that dream sometimes feels a little bit like a nightmare. But I just am still hopeful that if we keep calling ourselves to that, someday we'll get there.
Oh, beautiful answer. Beautiful answer. Well, Trisha, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It was so fun. Thanks for having me.
And if you're listening and this conversation has been helpful to you, I would suggest that you go on and look for Trisha and Jim Harrington's book. It's called The Leader's Journey. Really good. You can use it as an individual or with your staff or whatever group you're leading. Really, really helpful. Mm-hmm. So shout out.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Peace.
Hi everyone, this is Melissa Keller, Events Director for Vineyard Worship. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I've got a couple of ways you could really help us. First of all, review the podcast on iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Also, connect with us on social media, Instagram at the Ferment Podcast and Twitter at FermentCast. Thanks for listening. See you next time.